Photography was invented in 1839. Within 20 years, photographers were everywhere, in American cities, on battlefields, in the wilderness. The daguerreotype gave way to the wet plate negative. The wet plate gave way to the dry plate. By the 1860s, a skilled photographer could set up equipment almost anywhere and produce an image in seconds. And in those images, those extraordinary, fragile, irreplaceable records of the world as it looked in the first decades of photography, there are things that do not add up, not ghosts, not anomalies in the traditional sense, something more specific and more interesting. Photographs that show buildings, infrastructure, and urban development that the official construction record says had not happened yet. I want to be precise about what I am claiming, because precision is what makes this investigation different from speculation. I'm not saying these photographs prove a hidden civilization or an erased history. I am saying that when you cross-reference the earliest photographic archive against the official construction timelines of the buildings and infrastructure visible in those photographs, you find a pattern of discrepancies that the historical mainstream has not fully examined. Let me show you what I mean. The first case is the simplest, and it's one you can verify yourself in about 15 minutes using the Library of Congress Digital Archive. Matthew Brady's photography studios produced thousands of images in the 1850s and 1860s. Brady himself acknowledged, late in life, that many of the images attributed to him were taken by his assistants, and that the dating of those images was often imprecise. As the Metropolitan Museum of Art noted in its analysis of the Brady collection, it is difficult to know not only who took many of the pictures, but exactly when or where they were taken. This is not unusual. 19th century photographic archives are full of misdated images. A photographer might take a plate in 1858 but not develop it until 1861. An image might be catalogued decades later based on an archivist's best guess rather than documented evidence. The date on the archive entry is not always the date the photograph was taken. What this means is that when an archive entry says circa 1860, meaning approximately 1860, the actual image might have been taken anywhere from 1855 to 1865. And in that 10-year window, significant things were being built, demolished, and rebuilt in every major American city. The misdating problem is not a conspiracy. It is a documentation gap. But documentation gaps cut both ways. They mean that photographs we assume were taken after certain buildings were constructed might actually have been taken before. And they mean that the absence of a photograph is not evidence that something didn't exist. It might just mean no photographer was there, or the plate didn't survive, or the archive entry was lost. The second case requires more attention, and it connects directly to Chicago. After the Great Fire of 1871, Chicago was rebuilt rapidly. Construction records from the post-fire period are relatively well documented. The city had a strong incentive to track its own recovery, and insurance claims generated substantial paperwork. But the pre-fire records are a different story. The Chicago History Museum holds the most complete collection of pre-fire photographs of the city, images taken between roughly 1853 and 1871. These photographs were largely spared from the fire because many had been sent to other cities for reproduction or display. When researchers at the Chicago History Museum began systematically cataloging these images in the late 20th century, they found a recurring problem. Buildings visible in the photographs that had no corresponding construction records in the city's official files. Some of these could be explained by the fire. The construction records burned in 1871 along with everything else. A building photographed in 1865 might have perfectly legitimate documentation that simply no longer exists. But some of the discrepancies are harder to explain by record loss alone. There are images in the Chicago pre-fire archive that show multi-story stone structures in neighborhoods where the official record, based on the 1857, 1862, and 1869 property surveys that survive, shows only wooden construction. Stone buildings that shouldn't be there yet, according to the surveys. buildings that appear in photographs but have no corresponding entry in any surviving record. The most likely explanation is that the surveys themselves were incomplete. 19th century municipal record-keeping was inconsistent. Not every building was recorded in every survey, but incomplete surveys and incomplete photography archives together create a specific kind of gap. A gap in which the physical record, the actual stone, and the documentary record, the survey entries, don't fully match. And when they don't match, the question of which one is right is harder to answer than it sounds. The third case is the one that interests me most, because it involves not a single city but a pattern across multiple cities in a specific window of years. Between 1839, when photography was invented, and roughly 1870, the photographic coverage of American cities was extremely uneven. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington had relatively dense photographic records from the early 1840s onward. Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and the Midwestern cities had scattered coverage from the early 1850s. Western cities, San Francisco, Sacramento, Denver, had coverage from the Gold Rush era onward, starting from 1848 to 1850. In each of these cities, the earliest photographs show something that has become familiar from the last two investigations on this channel. A city in its first generation, provisional and improvised, alongside structures of a completely different character. The San Francisco panoramas from Nob Hill, taken circa 1855, show a city that had been incorporated only 6 years earlier. The vast majority of what's visible is wooden, the rapid construction of a gold rush settlement. But in certain areas of the frame, stone and brick structures appear that look substantially older than 6 years. Not older in the sense of deteriorated, older in the sense of belonging to a different construction tradition entirely. The same pattern appears in the earliest photographs of Cincinnati from 1848, in the earliest photographs of St. Louis from the early 1850s, in the earliest photographs of New Orleans from the late 1840s. In each case, the official explanation is straightforward. These were buildings constructed in the years or decades before photography arrived. The stone buildings in the 1855 San Francisco panorama were built in 1849, 1850, or 1851, after the gold rush but before the panorama. The stone buildings in 1848 Cincinnati were built in the 1830s and 1840s. Nothing anachronistic. That explanation is probably correct. But here's the problem it creates. If those stone buildings were built in the 1830s and 1840s, in cities that were, according to the official founding records, either very small settlements or barely established at all, then we're back to the question raised in the last investigation. Who built them, with what workforce, using what supply chains, and where are the construction records? The photograph confirms the building existed. The building's existence raises the same question whether the photograph shows it in 1855 or in 1845. The photograph just makes it impossible to dismiss. There is a specific category of photograph I want you to look for, because it demonstrates this problem more clearly than anything I can describe. It's the category that archivists call the before and after, photographs taken of a site before construction began, and then again after a building was completed. These were common in the 19th century as documentation of major projects. In several cases in the Library of Congress archive, the before photograph shows empty land or a small wooden structure. The after photograph, supposedly taken a few years later, shows a substantial stone or brick building that appears significantly weathered, aged in a way that seems inconsistent with the construction interval. Stone weathers slowly. Brick weathers slowly. A building that looks 50 years old in a photograph taken 5 years after its documented construction is a building that raises questions. Some of this can be explained by the photographic process. Early wet plate and dry plate negatives enhanced contrast in ways that could make surfaces appear older or more textured than they were. An archivist at the Getty Conservation Institute documented this phenomenon in a 2003 study of 19th-century architectural photography, noting that collodion wet plate negatives routinely produced images that made stone surfaces appear more weathered than they were in person. That's a real explanation. It accounts for some of the discrepancies, but it doesn't account for all of them. And the cases it doesn't account for tend to cluster in the same cities, in the same time window that every other investigation on this channel has been circling back to. The 1850s and the 1860s. The transition generation, the window that the 1890 census would have documented, that the WPA writers were trying to capture, that the orphan train system was actively disrupting. Photographs show us what was there. They don't tell us when it was built or how, and in too many cases from that specific window, the archives don't tell us either. Here is the question I want to leave you with. The Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division holds over 14 million images. The National Archives holds millions more. State historical societies, city libraries, university collections. The photographic record of 19th-century America is vast. Almost none of it has been systematically cross-referenced against construction records. Individual researchers have done this work for specific buildings, specific cities, specific projects, but a comprehensive, searchable comparison of photographic evidence against documentary evidence, building by building, block by block, across the major American cities in the 1840 to 1880 window has never been done. The technology to do it now exists. Machine learning systems can identify architectural features, approximate construction periods from visual evidence, and flag discrepancies between photographic and documentary records faster than any human team. No one has built that system, but the individual cases are there for anyone who looks. Here's one more specific example: the Daguerreian Society, the organization that maintains the most comprehensive index of surviving 19th-century American daguerreotypes, has documented several instances of images where the metadata conflict with the visual content. An image dated 1845 showing a structure that the local historical society has documented as built in 1852. An image dated 1851 showing street lighting infrastructure that the city records indicate wasn't installed until 1858. In each case, the Daguerreian Society's explanation is reasonable. The date is an estimate. The archivist who cataloged the image worked from incomplete information. The official construction date itself may be based on an incomplete record. All of those explanations are probably correct. But when you stack enough probably correct explanations on top of each other, when the photographic evidence and the documentary evidence fail to align across enough cases, in enough cities, in the same window of years, the aggregate pattern deserves more attention than any individual case. The photograph confirms the building existed. The building's existence raises the question, and the question has been waiting in the archive since 1839. The photographs are there. The archives are there. The question is just waiting for someone to ask it systematically. If you've been watching this channel from the beginning, you know we've been building toward this question from multiple directions. The 1890 census documented who was alive during this window, but it was destroyed. The WPA oral histories captured what they remembered, but they were defunded. The orphan train records documented where they came from, yet they are incomplete. The Chicago street-level images show what was physically there, but they are buried. And the construction records for the buildings show when they were built, but they are missing. And the photographs show what existed, but not when it was built or how. Every source converges on the same gap, the same window, the same generation. The photographs are the most democratic archive we have because they show what was there, regardless of what the official record says. They were taken by thousands of individual photographers with no coordinated agenda. They survived in collections around the world. And they're still raising questions that the standard account hasn't answered. This investigation isn't over. It's just getting specific enough to be useful. If you want to keep going, at Redacted Century is where this work happens. Every week, the archives, the photographs, the documents, and the questions the standard account treats as settled. Subscribe. Hit the bell. The full source list for this investigation, including the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division Search Portal, the Chicago History Museum Digital Archive, and the Getty Conservation Institute study on 19th century photographic processes, is in the description. The photographs are there. The questions they raise have been there since 1839. Nobody asked them systematically until now.